The letter trembled in Catherine Harper's gloved hands as the stagecoach rattled toward Cedar Springs, Wyoming territory, and she wondered if honesty would cost her the only chance at happiness she had left. She had lied in her correspondence, shaving 5 years off her true age of 32, and now the weight of that deception pressed against her chest like a stone. The year was 1882, and women her age were expected to be settled with families, not traveling alone across dusty plains to marry a stranger who believed her to be 27. The other passengers dozed or stared out at the endless prairie, but Catherine could not rest. Every mile brought her closer to James Mackenzie, the rancher whose letters had been kind and thoughtful, whose words had given her hope after 3 years of widowhood in Boston. She had no family left, no prospects, and no desire to become a burden on distant cousins who had already made their reluctance to help abundantly clear. This journey was her leap of faith, but the foundation was built on sand. The stagecoach lurched over a rut, and Catherine's carpetbags slid against her feet. Inside were her few possessions, a daguerreotype of her late husband Thomas, her mother's pearl brooch, and the letters from James tied with a faded ribbon. She had read them so many times the paper had grown soft. He wrote of his ranch, of the cattle and horses, of the mountains that turned purple at sunset. He wrote of loneliness, of wanting a partner to build a life with, of hoping to find someone who valued honesty and hard work. The irony of that last part made her stomach twist. She had not been honest. She had been desperate and foolish, and now she would have to face the consequences. The stagecoach driver called out that Cedar Springs was just ahead, and Catherine's heart began to race. She smoothed her dark blue traveling dress and checked that her hat was pinned securely. Her reflection in the small hand mirror showed a woman with fine lines around her eyes and mouth, threads of silver in her chestnut hair that she had tried to tuck away. She looked her age, perhaps older after the grueling journey. How could she have imagined he would not notice? Cedar Springs emerged from the plains like a promise half-kept. The main street was wide and dusty, lined with wooden buildings that looked sturdy enough but lacked the polish of eastern towns. A general store, a saloon, a hotel, a church with a white steeple. Men in worn hats and boots moved along the boardwalks, and a few women in simple dresses carried baskets or herded children. The stage pulled up in front of the hotel, and the driver climbed down to help the passengers disembark. Catherine stepped onto the street, her legs unsteady after hours of travel. She scanned the small crowd that had gathered, looking for the man she had seen only in a single photograph. James Mackenzie had a strong jaw and serious eyes, dark hair and broad shoulders. In the picture, he had not smiled, but something in his expression had seemed gentle. "Miss Harper," a deep voice said, and she turned. He was taller than she had expected, with sun-darkened skin and calloused hands. He wore a clean shirt and vest, a brown hat pushed back on his head. His eyes were the color of tobacco, and they studied her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He was perhaps 35, with the weathered look of a man who spent his days outdoors. When he removed his hat, she saw that his dark hair was thick and slightly too long. "Mr. Mackenzie," she managed, extending her hand. He took it carefully, as though afraid he might hurt her. His grip was warm and solid. "Welcome to Cedar Springs. I hope the journey was not too difficult." "It was long, but I managed." Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. He collected her trunk and carpetbag, loading them onto a wagon that waited nearby. The horse was a sturdy bay with a white blaze, and it stamped impatiently. James helped Catherine onto the seat, his hand at her elbow, and then climbed up beside her. As they pulled away from the hotel, she was acutely aware of his presence, the way his shoulders filled his shirt, the quiet competence in the way he handled the reins. "The ranch is about 5 miles out," he said. I have a housekeeper, Mrs. Dawson. She has prepared a room for you. I thought you might want some time to settle in before we talk about the wedding." Catherine nodded, grateful for the reprieve. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon creaking, the prairie stretching out on all sides. The land was beautiful in its starkness, golden grasses rippling in the wind, the sky enormous and blue. In the distance, mountains rose like sentinels. "It is very different from Boston," she said finally. "I expect so. Do you think you will like it here?" She looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability in the question. "I hope so." "Your letters made it sound like a place where a person could make a fresh start." "That was my intention when I came west 12 years ago. I wanted to build something of my own." He glanced at her, then back at the road. "I am glad you answered my advertisement, Miss Harper. Your letters were thoughtful. You seemed like someone who understood what it means to work for what you want." Guilt surged through her again. She had to tell him. She could not let this go any further without being truthful. But the words stuck in her throat and the moment passed. The ranch appeared gradually, first as a speck in the distance, then resolving into a house, a barn, corrals, and outbuildings. The house was larger than she had expected. 2 stories with a wide porch and rocking chairs. Chickens pecked in the yard and a dog ran out to greet them, barking joyfully. James pulled the wagon to a stop and helped Catherine down. The dog, a black and white border collie, circled her with enthusiastic sniffing. "That is Ranger," James said. "He is friendly but excitable." The front door opened, and a woman in her 50s with gray hair and a no-nonsense expression stepped out. "So this is the bride," she said, looking Catherine up and down. "You look worn out. Come inside and I will get you some tea, Mrs." Dawson was brisk but kind, showing Catherine to a bedroom upstairs that was clean and simply furnished. A quilt covered the bed and curtains fluttered at the window. "Supper is at 6, the housekeeper said. "I will bring up some hot water so you can wash. Mr. Mackenzie is a good man, miss. You will do well here if you are willing to work." Alone, Catherine sank onto the bed and covered her face with her hands. She felt like a fraud. She needed to tell James the truth, but how, when? She unpacked her few things, hanging her 2 dresses in the wardrobe, setting the daguerreotype on the bedside table. Thomas smiled up at her, forever young, forever gone. He had been a clerk, a good man but sickly, and his death from pneumonia had left her alone and nearly penniless. She had loved him, but it had been a quiet, companionable love. She wondered what kind of love she might find with James Mackenzie if he did not send her away. At supper, she sat across from James at a large wooden table. Mrs. Dawson served beef stew and fresh bread, then retreated to the kitchen. The silence was awkward at first, but James asked gentle questions about her journey, about Boston, about her family. Catherine answered carefully, telling him about her parents who had passed, about Thomas, about her decision to come west. "I am sorry for your loss," James said. "It must have been difficult." "It was, but life continues and I needed to find a new path." He nodded. "I understand. My own parents are gone. I have a brother in California, but we do not correspond often. This ranch is my family now." He paused, then added, "I hope it will be yours too." Catherine's throat tightened. "Mr. Mackenzie, there is something I need to tell you." He set down his fork, his expression attentive. "Please call me James, and you can tell me anything." She took a breath, her hands twisting in her lap. "In my letters, I was not entirely truthful about myself. I told you I was 27, but that is not accurate. I am 32. I know that is older than you expected, and if you wish to reconsider our arrangement, I will understand." The silence that followed felt eternal. Catherine could not bring herself to meet his eyes. She heard him shift in his chair, heard the clink of his glass as he set it down. Then he spoke, his voice low and warm. "Years only add to your grace, Catherine." She looked up, startled. His expression was gentle, his eyes steady. "You thought I would turn you away because of 5 years," he continued. "I am 36. I do not care about such things. What matters to me is character, honesty, and whether we can build a life together. You have been honest with me now, and that takes courage. I respect that." Tears pricked Catherine's eyes. "You are not angry." "Why would I be angry? You are here. You took a risk to come all this way. That tells me more about who you are than any number in a letter." He reached across the table, and after a moment she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, strong and reassuring. "I want you to stay, Catherine. I want us to try." Relief flooded through her, so intense it made her dizzy. "Thank you," she whispered. "You do not know what this means to me." "I think I do," he said quietly. Over the following days, Catherine began to settle into the rhythm of ranch life. She woke early, helped Mrs. Dawson with breakfast, and learned the routines of the household. James was patient and kind, showing her around the property, introducing her to the ranch hands, explaining the work that kept the place running. There were 3 men who worked for him: Charlie, an older cowboy with a limp and a wry sense of humor; Tom, a young man barely 20 with eager eyes; and Miguel, a quiet Mexican vaquero who was a genius with horses. Catherine found herself drawn to the animals. She had never been around livestock before, but there was something soothing about the cattle grazing in the pastures, the horses nickering in the barn. James taught her how to approach them, how to read their moods. He was a good teacher, never impatient, always encouraging. One afternoon, he took her riding. She had learned to ride as a girl, but it had been years, and she was nervous. James saddled a gentle mare named Molly and helped Catherine mount. They rode slowly through the grasslands, the sun warm on their shoulders, the wind carrying the scent of sage. James pointed out landmarks, told her stories about the ranch, about winters that buried the fences and summers that baked the earth hard. "Do you ever regret coming here?" Catherine asked. "Do you miss the East?" "No," he said without hesitation. "This land is hard, but it is honest. You know where you stand. I like that." She understood what he meant. There was a clarity to life here, a simplicity that was both challenging and freeing. As they rode back toward the ranch, she felt a contentment she had not experienced in years. The wedding was planned for the following Saturday at the church in town. Catherine spent the week sewing a new dress, a simple gown of cream-colored muslin with lace at the collar and cuffs. Mrs. Dawson helped with the fitting, her experienced hands making sure every seam was straight. The housekeeper had warmed to Catherine, approving of her willingness to work and her lack of airs. "Mr. Mackenzie is happier than I have seen him in a long time," Mrs. Dawson said one evening as they sat mending in the parlor. "He needed someone. This place was too quiet." "I needed someone too," Catherine admitted. "I did not realize how lonely I was until I started receiving his letters." On the morning of the wedding, Catherine woke early. Her stomach fluttered with nerves, but they were good nerves, anticipation rather than dread. She bathed and dressed carefully, pinning her hair up and securing her mother's brooch at her throat. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a woman who was no longer afraid. The lines on her face were a map of her life, and James had called them grace. The church was small and filled with sunlight. A surprising number of people had come, ranchers and townspeople who wanted to meet James's bride. Catherine walked down the aisle on Mrs. Dawson's arm, her eyes fixed on James, who stood at the altar in a dark suit. He looked solemn and handsome, and when she reached him, he smiled. It was the first real smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his face. The ceremony was brief. The minister spoke of love and commitment, of the challenges and rewards of marriage. Catherine and James exchanged vows, their voices steady. When James slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, Catherine felt tears slip down her cheeks. He wiped them away gently with his thumb, and then he kissed her, a soft, sweet kiss that held a promise. Afterward, there was a gathering at the hotel with food and music. People congratulated them, shook James's hand, welcomed Catherine. She met the mayor, the doctor, the schoolteacher, and a dozen others whose names she struggled to remember. But everyone was kind, and she began to feel that she might truly belong here. That night, James carried her over the threshold of the ranch house, and Mrs. Dawson tactfully retired to her own cottage out back. In their bedroom, Catherine felt a flutter of nervousness. She had been married before, but this felt different, more significant. James seemed to sense her uncertainty. He took her hands, his expression tender. "We do not have to rush anything," he said. "I want you to feel comfortable." "I am comfortable," she said, and realized it was true. She reached up and touched his face, feeling the roughness of his jaw. "I trust you, James." He kissed her then, deeper than before, and she responded, her arms going around his neck. The world narrowed to just the two of them, the warmth of his body, the gentleness of his hands. He undressed her slowly, reverently, and she did the same for him, discovering the planes and scars of his body. When they came together, it was with a tenderness that brought fresh tears to her eyes. This was not just desire, it was connection, a joining that went beyond the physical. Afterward, they lay tangled together, the moonlight streaming through the window. James traced patterns on her shoulder, his touch feather-light. "I am glad you came, Catherine," he murmured. "I did not know how much I needed you until you were here." "I am glad too," she whispered. "This feels like home." The days turned into weeks, and Catherine settled into her new life with surprising ease. She learned to bake bread in the wood stove, to churn butter, to tend the vegetable garden. She helped with the chickens and gathered eggs, and she spent hours in the barn with James, learning about the horses. She discovered she had a knack for gentling the skittish ones, her soft voice and patient hands winning their trust. James was a revelation. He was quiet and steady, but beneath that reserve was a deep well of kindness. He noticed when she was tired and insisted she rest. He brought her wildflowers he found on his rides. He told her stories in the evenings, about his childhood in Illinois, about his journey west, about the first years on the ranch when he had lived in a dugout and wondered if he would survive. One evening in late summer, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. James had his arm around her, and she leaned into his warmth. "I have been thinking," he said slowly, "about the future, about what we want to build together." "What do you mean?" she asked. "I want children if we are blessed with them. I want to grow this ranch, make it something that can be passed down. But more than that, I want a partnership. I do not want you to feel like you are just here to keep house. Your ideas matter. Your voice matters." Catherine's heart swelled. "I want that too. I want to be a true partner to you." "You already are," he said, kissing her temple. As autumn arrived, the ranch became a hive of activity. There was hay to harvest, cattle to move to lower pastures, repairs to make before winter. Catherine worked alongside everyone, her hands growing calloused, her body growing stronger. She loved the physical work, the way it tired her muscles and cleared her mind. She loved the camaraderie with the ranch hands, the way Charlie teased her and Miguel taught her Spanish words, and Tom looked at her with shy admiration. But most of all, she loved James. She loved the way he woke her with kisses, the way he held her at night, the way he looked at her as though she was the most precious thing in his world. Their intimacy deepened, not just physically but emotionally. They talked about everything, their fears and hopes, their past mistakes and future dreams. Catherine told him about the loneliness of her first marriage, the way she had felt invisible. James told her about a woman he had courted years ago who had refused to come west with him, who had called him foolish and small-minded. "I am glad she refused," Catherine said. "Because it brought you to me. I used to wonder if I had made a mistake choosing this life," James admitted, but now I know I was just waiting for the right person to share it with. One cold October morning, Catherine realized her monthly courses were late. Hope and fear tangled in her chest. She waited another week before saying anything to James, afraid to jinx it. But when she finally told him, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He swept her into his arms, laughing with joy, and spun her around until she was dizzy. "We are going to have a baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "We are," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. The pregnancy was not easy. Catherine was sick in the mornings, exhausted by midday. Mrs. Dawson clucked over her, making special teas and broths. James hovered, anxious and protective, until Catherine had to shoo him away so she could breathe. But despite the discomfort, she was happy. She had never thought she would have children. Thomas had been too ill, and after his death, she had assumed that chance was gone. Now, at 32, she was carrying new life, and it felt like a miracle. Winter came early that year, with snow in November and bitter winds that howled across the plains. James brought the cattle closer to the ranch, and the men worked in shifts to keep the animals fed and safe. Catherine spent her days indoors, sewing baby clothes, knitting blankets, preparing the small room next to theirs as a nursery. James built a cradle from oak, carving the edges with intricate patterns, his big hands surprisingly delicate. On Christmas Eve, they hosted a small gathering. Mrs. Dawson cooked a feast, and Charlie, Tom, and Miguel joined them, along with a few neighbors who had braved the weather. The house was warm and filled with laughter, the scent of pine and cinnamon in the air. Catherine looked around at the faces of these people who had become her family, and she felt a gratitude so intense it was almost painful. After everyone had left, James took her hand and led her to the window. Outside, snow fell softly, blanketing the world in white. "This time last year I was alone," he said quietly. "I never imagined I could be this happy." "Neither did I," Catherine said, resting her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for seeing past the lies I told. Thank you for giving me this chance." "You gave me a chance too," he said. "You took a risk on a stranger. That is no small thing." The baby came in late April, a warm spring day when the prairie was covered in wildflowers. The labor was long and hard, and there were moments when Catherine was afraid. But Mrs. Dawson was there, steady and experienced, and James held her hand, whispering encouragement. When the baby finally arrived, a lusty cry filling the room, Catherine sobbed with relief. "A boy," Mrs. Dawson said, wrapping the baby in a blanket and placing him in Catherine's arms. He was tiny and perfect, with a tuft of dark hair and James's nose. Catherine stared at him in awe, this new person she and James had created. James leaned over them, his eyes wet with tears. "He is beautiful," he said hoarsely. "You are amazing." They named him Thomas James, honoring both their pasts and their future. The baby was a joy and a terror, demanding and sweet, keeping them up at all hours. But Catherine had never been happier. She loved the weight of him in her arms, the milky smell of him, the way he grasped her finger with his tiny hand. James was a devoted father, walking the floor with Thomas when he fussed, changing nappies without complaint, singing off-key lullabies that made Catherine smile. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. James expanded the herd, bought more land, built a new barn. Catherine managed the household accounts, corresponded with buyers, and even helped with the horses. She had found a confidence she never knew she possessed. The woman who had arrived in Cedar Springs 3 years ago, frightened and full of self-doubt, was gone. In her place was someone strong, capable, and deeply loved. When Thomas was 2, Catherine became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and in the spring of 1886, she gave birth to a daughter. They named her Rose, and she had Catherine's hazel eyes and a temperament as sunny as her name. James was utterly besotted, carrying her everywhere, letting her pull his hair and drool on his shirt. The house was full now, bursting with life and noise. There were toys scattered in every room, childish laughter ringing through the halls. Mrs. Dawson, who had claimed she was too old to care about babies, spent hours making dolls and wooden animals for the children. Charlie taught Thomas to ride a pony, and Miguel showed him how to whistle. Tom, who had married a girl from town, brought his own baby to visit, and the children played together in the dusty yard. One evening, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Catherine and James sat on the porch as they had so many times before. The sky was a deep purple, stars beginning to emerge. James held her hand, his thumb rubbing over her wedding band. "Do you remember the day you told me your real age?" he asked. Catherine smiled. "I was terrified you would send me away." "I remember thinking how brave you were, and I remember meaning what I said. Years only add to your grace, Catherine. I meant it then, and I mean it now. You are more beautiful to me today than you were the day we met. You have given me everything," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "A home, a family, a purpose. I did not think I would ever have these things. We gave them to each other," he said. He pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, listening to the steady beat of his heart. In the distance, a coyote called, and the wind rustled through the grasses. The land stretched out around them, vast and unforgiving but also full of promise. "I want to grow old with you," James said quietly. "I want to watch our children grow and have children of their own. I want to sit on this porch when we are gray and remember all the years we have shared." "We will," Catherine said with certainty. "We will have all of that and more." The years that followed were not without challenges. There were droughts that tested their resources, harsh winters that took livestock, moments of fear and uncertainty. But through it all, Catherine and James faced everything together. They built a life that was rich not in material wealth but in love, in the bonds of family and community, in the satisfaction of hard work and shared purpose. Thomas grew into a strong, serious boy who loved the ranch as much as his father did. Rose was spirited and clever, with a gift for making people laugh. When Catherine was 38, she gave birth to another son, Samuel, who was quiet and thoughtful, happiest with a book in his hands. James joked that they were building their own crew of ranch hands, but Catherine knew he was proud of each child, loved them fiercely and without reservation. As the children grew, Catherine became more involved in the community. She helped start a school in Cedar Springs, served on the church board, organized socials and fundraisers. She was no longer the hesitant mail-order bride but a respected woman, someone people turned to for advice and support. She had found her place, her voice, and it felt powerful. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James surprised her with a trip to the mountains. Mrs. Dawson agreed to watch the children, and they rode out together, just the two of them, as they had in the early days. They camped under the stars, made love in a meadow carpeted with wildflowers, and talked until dawn. It was a reminder of where they had started, of the fragile hope that had brought them together. "I still cannot believe my luck," James said as they lay wrapped in blankets, watching the sun rise over the peaks. "That you answered my advertisement, that you took a chance on me." "I took a chance on us," Catherine corrected, "and it was the best decision I ever made." He kissed her, slow and deep, and she felt the familiar spark of desire. Even after 10 years, 3 children, and countless challenges, she wanted him as much as she had on their wedding night. Perhaps more, because now she knew him completely, the depths of his character, the strength of his love. As they rode back to the ranch, Catherine thought about the woman she had been when she arrived in Wyoming territory. She had been so afraid of being rejected, so convinced that her age made her less worthy. But James had seen past the numbers to the person beneath. He had taught her that grace was not about youth or beauty, but about resilience, courage, and the willingness to keep growing. The ranch came into view, and she saw the children running out to meet them, their faces bright with excitement. Thomas was nearly 11 now, tall and lanky. Rose was 8, her braids flying behind her. Samuel, at 5, toddled after his siblings, determined to keep up. James waved, and the children shouted with joy. "This is grace," Catherine said softly. "This life we have built, these children, this love." James looked at her, his eyes warm. "Yes," he said, "this is grace." They dismounted, and the children swarmed them, full of questions and stories about what had happened while they were gone. Catherine hugged each of them, breathing in their familiar scents, feeling the solid reality of them. This was her family. This was her home. And it had all started with a risk, a lie, and a man who had chosen to see her truth. As the years continued to unfold, Catherine and James watched their children grow into young adults. Thomas took over more of the ranch work, proving himself capable and responsible. Rose, headstrong and passionate, announced at 16 that she wanted to become a teacher. Samuel, the scholar of the family, dreamed of studying law. James and Catherine supported each of them, encouraging their ambitions while also teaching them the value of family and community. On Catherine's 40th birthday, James gave her a locket. Inside were tiny photographs of their 3 children. "So you can carry them with you always," he said. She fastened it around her neck, her eyes filling with tears. "I do not need photographs to carry them with me. They are written on my heart." "I know," he said. "But I wanted you to have something beautiful. You deserve beautiful things." "I have everything I need," she said, taking his hand. "I have you." The ranch thrived under their stewardship. James's reputation as a fair and honest rancher spread, and they became one of the most successful operations in the territory. But success did not change them. They remained humble, generous, and deeply connected to the land and the people around them. One summer evening, when Catherine was 45 and James was 49, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. It had become their ritual, this quiet time together at the end of the day. The children were grown now, Thomas married with a baby of his own, Rose teaching at the school in town, Samuel away at college in Denver. "Do you ever think about that day you told me your real age?" James asked, echoing a conversation they had had years before. Catherine laughed. "You asked me that on our 10th anniversary?" "I know, but I still marvel at it." "You thought 5 years would matter to me. I was foolish. You were human. We all carry fears." He took her hand, his grip still strong despite the arthritis that sometimes pained him. "But I meant what I said then, and I will say it again now. Years only add to your grace, Catherine. You are more beautiful to me at 45 than you were at 32, because I know you now. I know your strength, your kindness, your courage. I know the way you love our children, the way you love this land, the way you love me. That is grace." Catherine leaned her head on his shoulder, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I love you so much, James. You gave me a life I never dreamed possible." "We gave it to each other," he said, kissing her hair. "And we are not done yet. We have grandchildren to spoil, more sunsets to watch, more years to share." "Yes," she said, smiling through her tears. "We have all of that." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Catherine felt a peace that went bone deep. She had taken a risk all those years ago, stepping off a stagecoach in a strange town to marry a man she had never met. She had carried the burden of a lie, terrified it would cost her everything. But James had shown her that love was not about perfection or youth, or fitting into someone else's expectations. Love was about seeing each other clearly, accepting each other completely, and choosing each other every single day. The years continued to pass, gentle and swift. Thomas took over the ranch. running it with the same integrity James had shown. He and his wife gave Catherine and James 4 grandchildren, and the house once again filled with the sounds of young laughter. Rose married a banker from Cheyenne and had 2 daughters, spirited girls who reminded Catherine of herself. Samuel became a lawyer and returned to Wyoming, opening a practice in Cedar Springs and dedicating himself to helping homesteaders and small ranchers. Catherine and James grew old together, their hair silver, their bodies slower but their love undiminished. They spent their days in the rocking chairs on the porch, surrounded by grandchildren, telling stories of the old days when Wyoming was still a territory and the frontier was wild. They held hands as they had always done, their fingers intertwined, their hearts beating in rhythm. On a warm June afternoon, when Catherine was 62 and James was 66, they celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary. The family gathered at the ranch, 3 generations crowded into the house and spilling out into the yard. There was food and music, laughter and toasts. Thomas stood and raised his glass, his voice carrying across the crowd. "To my parents," he said, "who taught us what love looks like. Who showed us that grace is not about being perfect but about being true. Thank you for building this family, this home, this legacy." Everyone cheered, and Catherine felt James squeeze her hand. She looked at him, this man who had changed her life, and saw everything she needed in his eyes. Love, pride, gratitude, joy. Later, when the guests had left and the house was quiet, they walked out to the pasture where they had ridden so many times over the years. The moon was full, casting silver light across the land. James put his arm around her and she leaned into him, feeling the familiar warmth of his body. 30 years, he said. It feels like both a lifetime and a moment. I would do it all again, Catherine said. Every moment, every challenge, every joy, I would choose you every time. And I would choose you, he said. From the moment you stepped off that stagecoach, I knew. I did not know what it would look like, but I knew you were meant to be mine. I am yours, she said, and you are mine, always. They stood there under the stars, 2 people who had taken a chance on each other and built something extraordinary. The land stretched out around them, the same land they had worked and loved for 3 decades. It would be here long after they were gone, but they had left their mark on it in the fences they had built, the herds they had raised, the children they had brought into the world. As they walked back to the house, hand in hand, Catherine thought about the girl she had been, the woman she had become. She thought about the lie that had brought her here and the truth that had set her free. She thought about grace, that elusive quality James had recognized in her all those years ago. Grace was not about being young or beautiful or perfect. Grace was about showing up, being honest, doing the work. It was about love that deepened with time, about wrinkles that told stories, about hands that grew rough from labor but gentle in their touch. It was about 2 people who had chosen each other, not once but over and over again through every season of life. They climbed the porch steps, Ranger's grandson sleeping on the mat by the door. Inside, the house was warm and familiar, filled with the memories of a lifetime. They went upstairs to their bedroom, the same room where Catherine had stayed that first night, unsure and afraid. Now it was theirs, filled with their things, their history, their love. James helped her undress, his hands still tender after all these years. They climbed into bed and she curled against him, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. This was home. This was grace. This was love. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" he asked. "For seeing me, for loving me, for giving me everything." "Thank you," he said, kissing her forehead, "for being brave enough to come, for taking a chance on a lonely rancher. For building this life with me." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, the moonlight streaming through the window. Outside, the prairie stretched on forever, and the mountains stood sentinel in the distance. The wind whispered through the grasses, carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers, a promise of another day, another season, another year together. And in the morning they would wake as they always did, side by side, ready to face whatever came next. Because that was what they did. They showed up for each other, for their family, for the life they had built. They chose each other day after day, year after year. Years only add to your grace. James had said those words 30 years ago, and they had become the foundation of their love. Catherine had believed she was too old, too worn, too ordinary. But James had shown her that she was exactly enough, more than enough. She was grace itself. As the years rolled on into their 70s, Catherine and James slowed down but never stopped. They took walks instead of rides, sat more than they stood, but their love remained vibrant and alive. They held hands through doctors' visits and celebrated each birthday as a victory. They watched their grandchildren grow and marry, and they were blessed with great-grandchildren, tiny faces that carried echoes of their own. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the family threw a massive celebration. People came from all over Wyoming, friends and neighbors, former ranch hands, townspeople who remembered the young bride who had arrived on the stagecoach all those years ago. There were speeches and tears, laughter and music. Catherine and James sat in the place of honor, holding hands, their faces lined but their eyes bright. Thomas stood again to give a toast, his own hair now streaked with gray. My father once told me that he advertised for a mail-order bride because he was lonely. He wanted a partner, someone to build a life with, and my mother answered that advertisement even though she was afraid. She thought she was not good enough, not young enough. But my father knew better. He saw her grace, her strength, her courage, and together they built something that will last far beyond their lifetimes. This ranch, this family, this community. That is their legacy, and we are all richer for it. The crowd erupted in applause, and Catherine felt tears stream down her face. James leaned over and kissed her cheek, his own eyes wet. "We did well," he whispered. "We did very well," she agreed. That night, alone in their room, they lay in bed talking softly. James's health had been declining, his heart weak, and they both knew their time together was growing short, but there was no fear, only gratitude. "I am not afraid of dying," James said. "But I am sad to leave you." "You will never leave me," Catherine said fiercely. "You are part of me. You will be with me until my last breath and beyond." "I love you," he said. "I have loved you from the beginning, and I will love you forever." "I love you too," she said, and they held each other close, two bodies that had shared a lifetime, two hearts that beat as one. James Mackenzie passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 months later with Catherine holding his hand. He was 76 years old, and he had lived a full, rich life. The funeral was attended by hundreds, a testament to the man he had been and the impact he had made. Catherine stood at his graveside, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and said her final goodbye to the man who had given her everything. But she did not crumble. She grieved deeply and truly, but she also remembered his words. "Years only add to your grace." She had grace now, hard-won and precious, and she would honor his memory by living fully, by loving fiercely, by being present for her family. Catherine lived another 8 years, dying peacefully at the age of 70. In her final moments, surrounded by her children, she whispered James's name and smiled. Her family knew she was going to him, that they would be together again. They buried her next to James, under the wide Wyoming sky they had both loved. On her headstone, beneath her name and dates, were the words he had spoken to her so long ago. "Years only add to your grace." The ranch continued, passed down through the generations. Thomas's children ran it, and then their children, each generation adding their own chapter to the story. But they never forgot the foundation, the love story that had started it all. They told the tale of the mail-order bride who thought she was too old, and the cowboy who saw only grace. They remembered the courage it took to tell the truth, the kindness it took to accept it, and the love that grew from that moment of vulnerability. It became a family legend, a reminder that love was not about perfection, but about choosing each other, about seeing past the surface to the truth beneath. It was about grace, that quality that comes not from youth or beauty but from living fully, loving deeply, and facing life with courage. And so the story of Catherine and James Mackenzie lived on, whispered to children on the same porch where they had sat for so many years, told around dinner tables and at family gatherings. It was a story of risk and reward, of honesty and acceptance, of a love that had withstood the test of time. Years only add to your grace. Those words became a blessing passed down through the generations, a reminder that every line on a face told a story, every gray hair was earned, every year lived added depth and beauty. Catherine had worried that her age would make her less worthy, but James had shown her that the opposite was true. Her years had made her who she was, strong and capable and ready to build something extraordinary. Their love story was not a fairy tale. It was real and hard-won, forged in the fires of frontier life, tested by challenges and strengthened by choice. But it was also beautiful, a testament to the power of seeing each other truly, accepting each other completely, and choosing each other daily. And in the end, that was what mattered. Not the years, not the wrinkles, not the gray hair. What mattered was the love they had built, the family they had created, the grace they had found in each other. That was their legacy, and it would endure long after they were gone, a beacon of hope for anyone who wondered if they were too old, too worn, too ordinary to deserve love. Catherine Harper had stepped off a stagecoach in 1882, terrified and full of doubt. But she had taken a chance, told the truth, and found a man who saw her worth. James Mackenzie had been lonely and looking for a partner, and he had found so much more. Together, they had built a life of meaning and purpose, a love that transcended time. Years only add to your grace. It was true then, and it would always be true, because grace was not about perfection. It was about showing up, being honest, doing the work, and loving with your whole heart. Catherine and James had done all of that, and in doing so, they had created something beautiful. Something lasting, something worth remembering. And so their story lived on, a testament to the power of love, the beauty of grace, and the courage it takes to be truly seen. It was a story for the ages, a reminder that it is never too late to start again, to take a risk, to choose love. And that sometimes, the best things in life come when we are brave enough to tell the truth and fortunate enough to be met with understanding. Their porch still stood on the ranch, weathered but sturdy. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, the current generation would sit there and feel a presence, a whisper of the love that had been forged in that place. And they would smile, knowing that Catherine and James were together still, watching over the land they had loved and the family they had built. Grace upon grace, year after year, forever and always.